Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous, and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? Jesus asked. Yes, they replied. He said to them, Therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old.
Hey there, today we finish our series, Stories from Jesus. We've looked at 4 parables that Jesus told in his ministry, stories to really help bring people into a deeper truth or shed light on a reality that may be obscured from us. Today we hit on the 5th story in this series and the final one, so I'm glad that you are here today. Wherever you are, whatever's going on in your life, I hope you know how much God deeply loves you and cares about you. Our text today comes from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, and we're going to look at verses 47 through 50. But before we get there, there's some background leading up to this that would help us when we look at it to better understand why Jesus tells this story in the first place. If you notice, chapter 13 is full of stories that Jesus tells. What prompted him to tell all these stories? We go back to the end of chapter 12 for the answer to that question. Matthew chapter 12, and if you go back and begin in verse 46, here's what happens. While Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, Your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to them, Who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So really, when we get into chapter 13, the stories Jesus tells are commentary on these ending verses of chapter 12, where he's asked the question, or your mother and brother, your family's waiting for you, and he basically says, here's my family. Whoever does the will of God, my Father in heaven, is my family. So that sets the stage for all the stories that Jesus tells in chapter 13. It's not a random collection of stories. He tells them intentionally and with purpose. He's trying to bring his listeners, his original listeners, and those of us who read and study it today into a deeper reality of what it means to follow Jesus. So the location, if you look at chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, says the same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. And large crowds are coming to him, so he gets into a boat and he sits in the boat while all the people are standing on the shore. The scene here is the Sea of Galilee, often referred to as a lake as well because of the massive size. He gets up in a boat. Many people think, well, this might have been one of his disciples' boats. Maybe it was Peter's boat. We don't know for sure. And he begins to teach them. Now, this is reminiscent of another time in the ministry of Jesus when large crowds are following him and he goes up on a mount and he begins to teach them what we call the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. So you have the same situation here, just a different setting. He's not up on a mount. He's standing on a boat in the Sea of Galilee, preaching and teaching the people who are standing on the shore. I said that wrong. Jesus is actually sitting on a boat and the people are standing. Try that this Sunday at your church. Everybody stand and the preacher sits down and talks. If you think your preacher was long-winded before, you might think, goodness gracious, this is a lot of standing. So a lot of things happen in the ministry of Jesus throughout his time that were connected with water, the Sea of Galilee in particular. You remember it was walking along the shore where Jesus saw 2 brothers Simon and Andrew, and they were fishing. And he said, "Come, follow me. I'll teach you how to fish for people." And they left their nets and they followed him. A little further down, Jesus finds two other brothers, James and John. He issues the same invitation to them, "Come, follow me." They leave their nets and follow him. And they leave their father, Zebedee, behind. So understand, Simon, later called Peter, Andrew, his brother, James and John, and their father Zebedee, these were all commercial fishermen. They did this for a living. This was the way they provided for their families. These were not recreational fishermen. These guys got up every day and fished, and depending on what they were able to catch, greatly affected the ability they had to provide for their families. Jesus also walked on water. You remember that story? Walked on water one time. So water plays a huge role in the ministry of Jesus. Now there's another story at the end of the Gospel of John, chapter 21, which Peter's been fishing all night, and this is after the crucifixion of Jesus, after the resurrection. He's been fishing all night. He's coming in for the morning. He's exhausted because he hadn't caught anything. And Jesus tells him, "Cast those nets down again." And remember, the nets get so filled with fish that they have to call for extra help to get the net up. That's the kind of net that Jesus is talking about in our story today, the parable of the net. So before we get there, if you go back in a cursory review of chapter 13, from the boat, Jesus tells the stories of the parable, the weeds, the mustard seed, and the yeast. Then if you look at verse 36, there's a change that happens. Jesus leaves the boat and he goes into a house. And there he's talking specifically to his disciples. Because right away his disciples ask him a question. "Explain to us this parable of the weeds." Imagine that experience. You have a teacher that you really look up to, but you don't quite follow everything he's saying, and you get this personal time to sit down and listen to him further explain. So he begins to explain the parable of the weeds to them. And then he goes on from the house talking to his disciples, now not the large crowds of people, and he tells the story of the hidden treasure and the story of the pearl of great price, and our story today, the last one he tells in this series, the story of the net. Now, from all of these, he wants listeners to consider a very important question, a question that's relevant to us today. Am I really with Christ or against Him? Now, I know on the surface we think, well, that's a no-brainer. I believe in Jesus. I go to church. I am involved in a ministry. Of course I'm with Christ. But Jesus is shining a light on a deeper question. What does it really mean to follow Jesus? What does it really mean in our lives to be for Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus? That's what these stories want us to reflect on. So the story that was already read for us at the beginning of this recording, the parable of the net, let's go back and look at this a little bit. Again, the net here is a large weighted net, often called in those times a drag net, and it would cast a wide net. It would be on the back of the boat, and the boat would pull it along, and it would sweep up any fish that came into that area. So you'd have a massive collection of fish, typically good fish, bad fish, and by that I mean we know there's fish that are good for eating and fish that aren't good for eating. And we don't want to catch the ones that aren't good for eating. We want the ones that taste good. And so what they would do is they catch all this fish in this net, in this weighted net. They'd get to the shore, and the fishermen would begin sorting the fish, the good from the bad. Here's what we're going to keep. Here's what we're going to discard. And the good ones are the ones that they would sell and, of course, provide for their family. So Jesus draws this story of the net into a larger story. Remember, a lot of times in Jesus' stories, parables, he uses images, metaphors, to point to something spiritual. So he's taken something common, say, hey, consider this. And he says, now think about the spiritual reality. So that's what happens here. Look at verse 49 and 50. Here's the larger story. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's not so pleasant. But there's a deeper reality Jesus wants us to see here. So let's unpack this. As we're looking at this, remember Jesus uses that expression, the kingdom of heaven is like. It's a common expression for him to introduce his stories. Keep in mind, he's trying to think of everyday things that would help people better understand the kingdom of heaven. So in this story, he wants us to see a few things. The first one, and when you look at this, is the net seems to represent the gospel. The gospel has this huge reach. We know that all over the world the gospel is being preached. And the gospel simply is the good news about Jesus Christ. His life, His ministry, His death, His resurrection. So that's the good news. That's the gospel. And it's this wide net all over the world. So one thing we learn from this, or reminded of, is that the gospel is for all people. The gospel is to be shared with anybody, no matter what language they speak, no matter what their nationality is, no matter their ethnic background, no matter where they live or what their socioeconomic or education level is. The gospel is for all people. But not all people will stay on the path of the gospel. Some people who accept the good news about Jesus and initially commit their lives to Jesus will at some point abandon the gospel, leave Jesus, walk away from their faith. Jesus says, understand, one day there will be a clear separation made. So this is very similar to the parable of the weeds and the wheat that Jesus tells earlier in this chapter. But here he's focusing more on when that actual separation of good and evil comes to pass. So one quick reminder as we get into this part of the story. We don't do the separating. There's one judge, Jesus refers to here, who will send his angels to do the separating. None of us have the role of assigning somebody their eternal destiny. We're not in the role of that judge. The role is currently occupied. The church is not in the role of being that judge. There's only one judge, and none of us fit that job description. And even public opinion. Sometimes even away from the church where there's a public opinion. Well, you know, if you're good, if you do good things for people, and we redefine what it means to live and be a disciple in the kingdom of heaven all the time. So one of the things we can do as Christians is to remember there's only one judge, and we need to stop judging the hearts of people. Have you ever drawn a wrong conclusion about somebody? Maybe you saw them doing something and you immediately assumed it was negative. And then later you came to find out there wasn't anything negative about that at all. Years ago in my first ministry, I remember there was a guy, I liked him a lot. We played church softball together, church basketball together. But I noticed on Sundays he would never sing when we were doing the singing. And I thought, well, that's weird. He's just sitting back there and he doesn't even open his mouth. So one day we went to lunch and I thought, you know what? I'm making some assumptions. I probably just need to ask him why he doesn't sing. So in the course of the lunch, I said, hey, can I ask you something? I noticed that you typically don't sing. And he smiled and he said, yep. Well, the reason for that is I'm tone deaf. And rather than me try to sing off pitch, which it bothered him, he says, it's a blessing to just sit there and listen to other people sing. I thought, wow, well, I was totally wrong about my conclusions. See, when we start playing the role of judge and we start issuing sentences of condemnation or exoneration based upon our personal feelings and what we think is happening in we get so off base so quickly because we're not called to do that. Look, if you have some conclusions about somebody and you're just not sure, go talk to that person. Ask that person rather than condemn them in your mind. So a couple reminders here. How do we know that we are not in the role of judge? Well, in the book of Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul goes to the city of Athens. And in Athens, he winds up having discussions about Jesus with Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. It's an incredible account. And one of the things that Paul says is there is only one judge. In fact, in Acts chapter 17, verse 31, Jesus says this specifically, "For God has set a day when He will judge the world by justice by the man He has appointed." Now, if we have any doubt who that is, Paul clarifies it with the next statement. "He has given proof of this to everyone by raising Him from the dead." Jesus is in this role. So another thing we gather from this, and we see this in the parable of the weeds and the wheat, is that God is patient with us. God's desire is not to condemn anybody. God extends to us mercy and grace. How do we know this? Well, if you go back to 2 Peter chapter 3, we get these incredible words. I don't have it written on my sheet here, so let me turn to it in my Bible, and I hope you will too. We'll go back to Matthew 13, but this is such a beautiful passage to remind us about the patience of God and what it means for us. Jesus says in the story we're looking at today, there will come a time of separation where the good and the bad will be separated. But why hasn't that happened yet? Well, we get the answer in 2 Peter chapter 3. Look at verse 8 and 9. "But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping His promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." Look, if you've made it through the teen years, be thankful that people were patient with you. Because we can all look back at our years of growing up and see times in our lives where we were not very lovable. And if you made it through those years, look back on the people that were so patient with you because they believed in you. They prayed for you. They believed that at some point you would come back around. This is God believing the best in us, longing for that to happen. And He's patient for us because His ultimate desire is not to condemn anyone. He doesn't want to do that. But at some point, there will be a separation. So until that time comes, He pours on us mercy and grace through His amazing love, hoping that we'll come back to Him. God is patient. So in light of this, what kind of people should we be? How should we live? This goes back to the question Jesus is trying to get at with His stories. Am I really for Christ or am I against Christ? Back in 1835, the great American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, you may be familiar with his book, The Scarlet Letter. Maybe you had to write it or read it in school. He wrote another short story called Young Goodman Brown. And this story is only about, depending on what edition you get, 20 pages, maybe 22 at the most. And it's about this young man who lives in Salem, Massachusetts, and he's married to a incredible woman named Faith. And they're both so committed to their belief in God and wanting to do what's right. And then one day he decides to take a journey into the forest. And in the forest he encounters things that he cannot explain. And he sees things that trouble him so deeply. And he encounters a mysterious figure who Hawthorne portrays as the devil. And the devil shows him things. People from the town that he knows, from his preacher to town council members, to prominent citizens, and he sees them engaging in evil. And then he even finds his wife is in that group. Now, he never knows for sure if that was just a dream, a bunch of lies that the devil was spinning, or if he actually saw reality. But he goes back into that town, and he can't look at anybody the same. He can't even act the same toward his own wife, because in his heart's been corrupted to the point where he believes everybody is a hypocrite. And he winds up living in misery for the rest of his life because he can't get past that. There's an interesting line in this story early on where he's talking about his wife and talking about the faith that they both have. And he believes her faith is much stronger than his. And he makes this particular statement. He says, "I'll cling to her skirts and follow her to heaven." The implication being that she is his ticket into heaven. He just has to stick next to her. And even though that's a secondary point in this story, Hawthorne makes this important point to us, and that is, you can't ride someone else's faith into heaven. To be a disciple of Jesus is not to say, well, my mom is a good Christian, or my daddy's a good Christian, or my wife is a good Christian. If I just stay close to them, I'll get into heaven by attrition. We all get into heaven by the grace of Jesus. We all have to answer the question that's being asked in these stories. Am I really with Christ, or am I against Him? And only you can answer that question. So to wrap all this up, going back to the story of the weeds and the wheat in verses 24 through 30 that Jesus explains in verses 36 through 43, Jesus talks about a farmer's field of wheat. And one day his workers go out and they find that weeds have grown up among the wheat. And they're distraught by this because they've done everything that they're supposed to do to prevent weeds. So they go and they tell the farmer who owns the land, and he says, somebody has intentionally done this. Somebody has planted weeds among our wheat field. And his workers say, do you want us to pull them up? And Jesus says, no. Or the farmer says, I should say. Because if you pull up the weeds, you might pull up some of the wheat too. Let's wait until harvest time, and then we'll separate. We'll separate them. When Jesus explains this story, listen to his words. Go back to verses 37 through 42. The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. That would be Jesus. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. And then he goes on to present that judgment narrative of separation, where there will be a separation, and the good will be welcomed in the kingdom of heaven, and the bad will be thrown into a blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's horrific imagery, because you have not only despair, that's the weeping, but the gnashing of teeth could be defiance, that God would actually follow through on what He said He was going to do. Have you ever been there? Where someone defined the parameters for you, and you said, I'm going to do my own thing. And then you were absolutely shocked that they actually stuck to the parameters and the punishment that was connected with breaking those parameters. Isn't it amazing? That's the weeping and gnashing of teeth. The defiance and the gnashing of teeth, almost like a snarl, like, how dare you do this to me? And the despair of understanding that ultimately God is just in what He does. Look, evil will remain until the end of the world. The church is never going to be able to root out all the evil in the world, because the world is tainted. But it's not our job to pull those weeds. Our job is to share the gospel. And while we grieve the weeds, Jesus gives us hope. He presents these stories to inspire us to examine our commitment to Him. He gives instruction through these stories about our role. And it's not to pass sentences of condemnation on other people. But then Jesus invites us to participate fully in His continuing ministry, to bring light to dark places. And this gets at the heart of being a disciple of Jesus. It's not just being a student and acquiring knowledge, it's putting that knowledge into practice. It's being fully committed to Jesus, to convey and deliver and present the gospel everywhere that we go. So let's end all this with a word of hope. Here's what Jesus says will happen for those who do this. Verse 43. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. What imagery. Incredible. When I was attending seminary, grad school, I was already married. We had one kid, and toward the end of my time in seminary, Mindy got pregnant with our second child. And I would drive about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on traffic, to go to classes. And on cold days, one of the things I like to do is to step out of the library between classes and go sit in the car and feel the warmth of the sun on those cold days when it was sunny. And the warmth I would feel of the sun coming through that glass was such a nice, comforting feeling. And that's what Jesus says here. Look, someday you're going to experience this warmth in its entirety. You're going to shine like the sun in the kingdom of God. What a beautiful image to end on. The warmth, the comfort, and the hope. And knowing that that is what Jesus says will happen, well, don't you want to be a part of that? And don't you want to tell others of this incredible promise that Jesus gives to us?